pretty good questions sessions here. When I first began preparing for today, I kind of faced the dilemma that two dilemmas that writers often do. Your first one is, where am I going to find enough information to fill up this time? Then you get your research, say, how am I going to cut this all down to fit into this time? And I really appreciated, our first two speakers here. I got both their books here at the beginning of this month and read them quite thoroughly. In fact, last week I was sitting there stewing so much about Sonny Reisch and about Nelson's story that I finally said, you better put this down and start to work on your own stuff so you got something to talk about. And it's good to be here again, with this the old story, or the old Kearny Community Hall here is pretty, I remember back in the late 60s and early 70s, I was in high school coming to dances out here. And thank God the statute of limitations ran out of all those activities that we had back then. And I'm probably about the same age as Kearny Hall, and I've too had quite a few structural and plumbing repairs over the years, so it's good. But anyway, I mostly decided on several themes and subjects to talk about, kind of a potpourri type of thing, rather than trying to really focus in and beat some subject to death here. And so maybe if there's going to be a title for discussion, it should be maybe Myths and Facts, Carrington, John Phillips, the Economic Effects of the Bozeman Trail Forts and the Railroad Factor. Audience I kind of was thinking about, be kind of a general audience, someone who had some knowledge of Fort Phil Kearny. But looking at this crowd, I see there's probably very extensive knowledge of what I'll be talking about. So if I'm seeming a little elementary to a lot of you in some of this discussion here, please bear with me on that. Again, my audience is kind of towards those that haven't heard some of this information before. Well, the first thing I want to talk about is just some things about Henry Carrington. And he really is quite an amazing and interesting character. Having worked at Fort Phil Kearny for 25 years, the man is very much a part of my life. And I kind of lived in the shadow of him, although his tenure at Fort Phil Kearny was 6 months and I was 25 years. So we had that a little bit different there, but every day he seemed to be he played a great part in my life. And one of the subjects about him that kind of blew up, both the time when he was alive and continued in certain form since, is that he lost his command here, or he's relieved of his command here, because of the Fetterman battle, because of that disaster, which basically wasn't true. The fact is that he has already decided that he would be leaving Fort Phil Kearny. You may probably know that already, but he's decided, in fact, that past summer, that his tenure at Fort Phil Kearny was limited. In the summer of 1866, Congress passed what was called the Army Reorganization Act, and is passed July 28, 1866, and signed in by President Andrew Johnson. And it was set to be effective January 1st, 1867. Now what this did is all the blown up Union Army that we saw in the Civil War were mostly volunteer regiments. There were only 19 what we call regular Army regiments. And the 18th Infantry, of which Colonel Carrington had been made the commander of during the Civil War, really at the beginning in 1861, was one of these 19 regiments. And so what the Army decided to do is have a permanent army after it wouldn't be very permanent very long, but an army of 45 regiments, and this would be made by taking the 1st, the 2nd, and the 3rd Battalion of the 11th through the 19th regiments. So this would include the 18th Infantry, and making those into new regiments. So the 1st Battalion of the 18th Infantry remained as the 18th Infantry. The 2nd Battalion was slated January 1st, 1867 to become the 27th Infantry. And the 3rd Battalion, which we don't hear much around here because it was stationed over by Fort Bridger and to Salt Lake City and Camp Douglas in that area over there, would become the 36th Infantry. But the 1st, 2nd Battalion were the two that would play some roles around here. Colonel Carrington had requested and was slated to remain as commander of the new 18th Infantry, the 1st Infantry, or the 1st Battalion. So he was going to be switching his command to a fort, either Fort Casper, Fort Fetterman, or forts further south like Fort Sedgwick or Fort McPherson as a commander of that regiment. The 27th Infantry would remain here at Fort Phil Kearny and Fort C.F. Smith, and a new commander would be appointed for it, and then the 36th Infantry I mentioned would over by Fort Bridger would be over there. So it was already decided that Carrington would be leaving. In January 1st, 1867, his job title would switch. Now maybe the Fetterman fight might have sped that along some, because you wonder why in the world did they leave here in the middle of January in that terrible cold freezing weather and have that terrible trip first down to Fort Casper and then on down to southern posts. But the reason being that the Army, that was the change that the Army was making. Now, Carrington was not fired from here. He was not relieved because of the battle. He was, again, already slated to leave. But he was a fascinating man in himself. He trained as a lawyer. Well, he didn't have combat experience. He had a great deal of military experience, and was a great politician. One of the reasons perhaps he didn't get censored or anything for the Fetterman fight, because he had very strong influences with the Republican Party. And so General Grant and many of the military officers were Republicans at this time. And people like General Sherman, whose brother was from Ohio, as Sherman was, and knew Carrington, probably protected him some that way. So again, if you hear that Carrington, was relieved because of the Fetterman disaster, that wasn't the case. He was already slated to move at that time. And Carrington was also a victim of, I guess, a fake news of the period. A lot of people wanted to make him the scapegoat. The Department of the Interior, and specifically the Indian Affairs Bureau, they had stories out that it was because treaty goods had been given the Indians, and that's why they were being the word hostile used back then against the soldiers out here. Newspapers back then were just as voracious as papers are today, and reporters that had never left Philadelphia or New York were writing and publishing stories about how the Indians were starving because Carrington would not give them ammunition for their weapons to go hunt buffalo. And that's why they attacked Fetterman's troops. And not only that, but Fetterman's troops came back, they retreated to the fort, and Carrington would not open the gates, and there were soldiers banging on the gates, pleading to get in. And, Carrington wouldn't open the gates. So he not only had to deal with, his superiors that in many cases didn't like him, but he also, for the rest of his life, had to deal with the effects of these really outrageous newspaper and press stories that came out about him. Well, another person at Fort Phil Kearny that we have had some myths built up about is John Phillips, Portuguese Phillips, or Portuguese, I guess is the way you want to pronounce it, Portuguese Phillips. He was an early immigrant into the country, having jumped a ship out in San Francisco Bay in 1850, and then becoming a miner and a pioneer, a frontiersman. Came to Fort Phil Kearny, and his claim to fame that would make him famous was his ride from Fort Phil Kearny down to Fort Laramie after the Fetterman fight, which he took news down first to Horseshoe Station, where appeals and of what had happened and the need for reinforcements was sent out in the telegraph, and then on to Fort Laramie, where he had some other dispatches to deliver to the commander there. The story was that he left alone, and later many accounts been to embellish it, to where pretty soon he had several Indians after him. 50 years later, he had 500 Indians after him, depending on the story that you read, and a number of poems were written about him. Very much the effort was made to turn him into a Paul Revere type of character. Well, the first part of his myth is that he didn't ride alone. He might have left alone, but he joined up very soon with another man, Daniel Dixon, and both of them were not doing this ride out of the goodness of their heart for the soldiers of the fort. They were going to be paid $300 each to get this information down to Horseshoe Station and for Phillips and some other dispatches to Fort Laramie. They did ride through pretty terrible conditions as far as weather, but they stopped at Fort Reno, 56 miles south here, and spent at least a day there, maybe more. Probably switched out horses, and then stopped again, maybe at somewhere like Deer Creek Station, but eventually down to Horseshoe Station. Probably switched horses again there, and then Phillips went on to Fort Laramie, where he did arrive. He arrived, there was a dance going on, but the story then that here comes this big, large figure in a bearskin coat or a buffalo robe, striding into the dance. One had him passing out from the effects of the weather after he delivered the message to the commander. Other just that he brought news of the Fetterman battle, and that was the beginning of troops preparing to go to Fort Phil Kearny to relieve and rescue the troops up here. But there again, he did not go alone. He probably stopped several places along. Probably definitely changed out horses. Those of you who are familiar with horses know that taking one horse 265 miles in bad weather might not work too good. But the myth continued to even grow bigger about him. If you go to Fort Laramie, there's a monument. Over here, there's a monument to Portuguese Philip for his ride. Well, at Fort Laramie, there's a monument to the horse he rode, in which it says that, I think it was Grable, one of Carrington's prize thoroughbreds, and that the horse dropped dead on the parade ground when they got to Fort Laramie. Again, no real account of, much as some things with Nelson's story, there are some places where you don't find quite the clear accounts that you might be looking for. But he was really quite an amazing figure in his own right, having been a frontier miner for quite a few years before he came to Fort Phil Kearny. And after his famous ride, he then became a mail carrier for a while. And he had a great story when he's a mail carrier. He was going down to Bridger's Ferry, took the mail down, and then coming back, he kind of disappeared for a few days. And the quartermaster here, a gentleman named Captain George Dandy, said, "Well, where have you been? What have you been doing? And taking your time getting back here." And he had this story that he had to build a bridge because the stream had been flooded. And then he ran across the mail scatter of another mail carrier's party that had been attacked and wiped out by Indians. And he collected some mail of that. And then the Indians did get after him. He says, "But for my trusty steed and my two revolvers, I would not be here to talk to you about this." And that one might have took place. That sounds very plausible in many ways. After Fort Phil Kearny closed, then he went down, eventually established a ranch down towards Cheyenne, down around Chugwater, if you're familiar with the little town there. And then later moved into Cheyenne and spent the rest of his life until he passed away as a citizen of Cheyenne. And in that time, he told many people his story and others, and that's where the embellishments came from. So again, the story that Phillips wrote alone, you'll run across that, as you'll run across it today. Just remember that he didn't ride alone. That's pretty much documented by history. But he still had quite the adventures in his time at Fort Phil Kearny and afterwards. Another subject that I kind of wanted to touch on here was the fact of the economic effects of the forts. And forts, all the forts, Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, Fort C.F. Smith, were economic magnets that drew people to the areas of the frontier that they normally wouldn't be going to. I mean, who would be in the middle of this, the Sioux hunting lands, unless there's a reason to be here? And the reason to be here were these forts. And they were a cash cow for many businesses and for individuals. The transportation of supplies to these forts was quite expensive. You look at it was a railhead at the time Fort Phil Kearny was established, was 600 miles away from Fort Phil Kearny, down in Nebraska. So that supplies all had to come by oxen or mule teams brought up the Oregon Trail and then the Bozeman Trail to Fort Phil Kearny and the other Bozeman Trail forts, all to C.S. Smith. And it was astronomical what it cost. In a minute here, I've got a quote from one of the lieutenants here, just about what the expense of the forts were. And not only was the expense of that, and so things such as, in talking about, with Johnny Hart, the idea of working for Wells Fargo and bringing supplies up here. Wells Fargo was a big supplier. They brought up a lot of supplies into this area, and there were other contractors. And then along with that, as John Russell talked about, when Nelson Story got to Montana, he didn't just ride past, after he got his herd here, got his herd past Carrington and then went to Montana, and just didn't, disappear into the vapors of history in Montana, never to be seen around Fort Phil Kearny in this area again. He was very active in terms of bringing supplies down to Fort C.S. Smith and also down as far as down here to Fort Phil Kearny. Again, the potatoes that John mentioned that were pretty valuable at Fort C.S. Smith and down here, because scurvy was a problem. The scurvy was so bad in that spring of 1867 that Private Murphy wrote an account called The Lost Battalion, and he says that they were all in the hospital with scurvy, and so in the spring they went out and they were crawling around the fields outside of the stockade looking for wild onions, and they were told, don't eat the wild onions, they're poisonous, they might kill you. He said, well, we'd rather die eating the wild onions than to die laying here of scurvy. And so, something like potatoes were, worth the price of whatever Nelson Story could charge, he was probably going to get from the military in these situations. The other factor very much is that the people that worked around these forts, and they did very well in terms of, let's see, where's my figure here at? In terms of what they were paid. And then, we hear people talk about the woodcutters here and the people that, that built certain carpenters worked around the fort. Woodcutters, drovers that took care of the military cattle and the civilian cattle. But just to give an idea of during the years of just 1 year here at Fort Phil Kearny in 1867, starting in January, the total number of civilian employees was 111. These are just for the Army. These are not the civilian contractors' employees. And then for February, 137, 102, 98, 76, 95 in June, 87 July, August 133, September 130, 54, and October 141. It drops down again in the winter months to 74 and 76 for that year. So what kind of people were here and what were they getting paid? Well, for instance, a clerk. You had one clerk hired, you had two clerks hired, one at $150 a month and one at $125 a month. One storekeeper, $100 a month. 3 mail carriers, $10 per day, $620. 4 mail carriers at $25 per month. I don't know what the difference was. Who got the good? Maybe it's first class and some other type of parcel mail. But one guide, $10 per day. That's $300. One guide at $150 per month. and on, but woodcutters, let's see, one wheelwright at $50 per day, one blacksmith per month, one engineer $80 per month, 5 ambulance drivers at $45 per month, 2 cooks at $45 a month. But anyway, these were pretty darn good wages when you figure that an Army private here, and if you were somebody that enlisted in the Army back in New York City or in Ohio, probably the main area for recruitment for the 18th and the 27th Infantry would have been the Ohio Midwest region. You get out here, you're going to make the grand total of $13 a month. So a soldier's getting paid $13 a month. He's on guard duty protecting the woodcutters, the guides, everybody else, the wheeler. So he's protecting the fort, protecting all these people that are making a lot more than he is. And even the colonel made $212 a month. Jim Bridger made $300 a month. So, it was very lucrative to be out at these forts. It's a reason why people might take the danger coming into Indian country to the magnet that these forts were. Later, as the forts are starting to close, they're trying to fire a bunch of these people because they're way too expensive to keep around. Like Jim Bridger, they finally said, well, they're going to let him go because can't afford the guy at that stage, whether he's a good, a good guide or not. But it also, the morale of the troops in these places was pretty poor in situations. Now you're out here, what are you going to do? It's kind of hard to desert from Fort Phil Kearny. You get over the hill and you got problems. So often they would wait until a train, hopefully maybe well, there weren't many immigrant trains going, but say like one of the contractor trains, whether it be a Wells Fargo or somebody else, it's going up to Fort C.F. Smith. And then they might desert and try to hide out in that train if they can hire somebody to hide them in their wagon to get up to a Bozeman and to get to the gold fields and desert that way. And some made it. The guardhouse usually had 4 or 5 guys in it that tried to get away from here. But again, just the morale. There's, when they weren't supposed to be able to get alcohol, but I read one account of where the soldiers were all of a sudden the soldiers were turning up drunk. And the officers were perplexed. They said, well, how are they managing to do this? Well, they went over the hill towards Buffalo, and they said there's a peg-legged scoundrel with one eye patch, sounds like a pirate or something, with a Red River wagon, which is one of those wagons with the big wheels, just 2 big wheels. And he was selling alcohol just about 2 miles from the fort. The soldiers had found him weeks before. The officers found him and they escorted him out of the territory and got rid of him. But again, the magnet of this place, and this guy's showing up here. Everybody else worried about can't go to the hill because an Indian's going to kill you, and he's sitting 2 miles away from here, selling alcohol to the soldiers on the sly. So it's, again, it's just a fascinating things that did happen around here in that way. They even had to hire watchmen to look out for the warehouses because they didn't trust the soldiers to guard the warehouses because the soldiers might be breaking into them. So it's really quite a situation of how much money was being spent on these kinds of things around here. I just had one here, if I can find it. This is a gentleman, he's passed away. He was on the Fort Phil Kearny board, but Lieutenant Colonel Helen Hart, who was a local. He spent a career in the National Guard. He'd been in Korea. Went to the War College and was fairly knowledgeable and made a pretty good knowledge of the military. But he did find a quote here from Lieutenant Alexander Wishart, who was one of the officers here and was involved a couple of days after Wagonbox fight building a corral. If you go over there's what's called the Wishart Corral to the west of where the Wagonbox Monument is. And an interesting fellow, but this is a letter, and Ellen wrote this down. A young lieutenant stationed at Fort Phil Kearny wrote several letters to the editor of the Washington Review in the fall of 1867 expressing his opinions on the Mountain District operations. The villainous character of this so-called war, and our young men prepared to rush into the fray when it is not necessary for the salvation of the country and for the preservation of government. The Indians' fast-changing method of warfare have been taught new tactics by the whites and half-breeds among them, and they are armed with rifles and revolvers, the latest patterns. That's debatable, but anyway, these guys embellished their letters too. Now, if the Bureau of Indian Affairs were abolished and the whole trouble turned over to the War Department, the whole trouble would be over in a short time. Either prosecute the war vigorously or give it up to him, or give to him his hunting ground. And his statement that Vietnam wasn't so unique after all. Lieutenant Wishart's comments, with but slight variation, were echoed over and over again in our most recent experience in limited warfare. And this is Wishart again. The barbarities of a savage war caused the people to groan with additional burdens of tax and revenue. The expense of this war is $1 million a week, and each Indian killed has cost $200,000, and what have we gained? Is this country worth it? Well, at this time, 1867, there were no more civilian wagon trains weren't coming up the Bozeman Trail. The only traffic really were the wagons supplying the military posts, and so everything was basically holding on and defending these forts up here. And for what purpose? I'll talk about in a minute. Maybe one of the purposes, and then Ellen went on to say that $200,000 is the exact amount given as the cost of each Viet Cong casualty 100 years later in 1867. So you wonder what was the Mountain District involved in more than just guarding a secondary trail? Makes a question mark. He again goes on to state what will be the last thing that I'll be talking about, which is this idea of the railroads. And he says primary and secondary routes. Maintenance of the primary route through this area, the Mormon, Oregon, California, Overland Trail is very definitely the national interest. The secondary trails, which the Bozeman is probably the best known, was not vital to anyone's survival, but were useful to some extent to the mining and mercantile interests at one end and their eastern suppliers at the other end. These Westerners were able to make enough noise that these trails sounded vital, introducing one more factor. It's mainly on the secondary trails that the major conflicts of the Indians occurred, and it was here that the cry began for their removal. The cry quickly doubled as these problems foremost troubles to the ultimate solution just beginning its western thrust, namely the railroad. The railroad itself was a logistics effort of massive proportions. More people, energy, and a greater share of the nation's wealth went into it than in today's space efforts. The full impact is difficult to perceive. It was an absolute necessity in the continuation of Western expansion, and as a bond to the west coast of the nation, the Transcontinental Railroad had to proceed without interference. Besides the governing backing of the construction bonds, it could not fail without very serious economic consequences to the entire nation. The Indian was not to be used as an excuse for delay or to raise costs. It is in this context that the Army enters as a principal participant in the westward expansion. It is in this context that strategy and funding were planned. I read that and I got a little ahead of where I was going on that, the last thing I want to talk about was this idea of the impact of the railroad on the Bozeman Trail and the impact of the Bozeman Trail on the railroad. The controversy kind of rose up. A historian many of you might remember, Robert Murray, had put forth a thesis that the Bozeman Trail forts were a diversion to pull the Indians away from the construction of the Indian Pacific Railroad. And the reaction to that has been, well, our military wouldn't do that. And the idea that these people up here were not, that would almost imply a sacrificial lamb to allow the railroad to be built. But these soldiers up here, that was not the intent, really. And I kind of got involved in this somewhat. I don't know whether you've read or seen the book Promises. I've got a little section in there. And Cyril Chapman that wrote this kind of got me going off on some aspects as far as the military was. Let's see. And of course I'm going to lose that one. Okay, here we go. So in this, and I kind of was talking somewhat, incorporating some of what Murray had expressed to me, and some other things. Get enough room for that and my glasses up here together here, I guess. Okay, let's try this. Can you hear me now? Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. Anyway, this is starting with the idea of garrisoning the Powder River country began with Granville M. Dodge and Patrick E. Connor. They wanted to establish forts in the Powder River and the Yellowstone rivers, the theory being that the military should march in the heart of the Sioux and Cheyenne hunting grounds to prosecute a punitive campaign, then build the forts. Connor launched that expedition in 1865, but it wasn't a well thought out policy and never clearly defined. When you review the military record, you detect that there were ulterior motives, that a lot of things are going on behind the scenes that weren't spoken. There's a school of thought that says a good portion of policy for establishing the forts in the garrison Bozeman Trail was a conscious attempt by Sherman to divert the Indians' attention away from the railroad and to the posts of the Bozeman Trail. Of course, that remains speculative because it was unwritten and publicly unspoken, but it raises a significant ethical question. Were these garrisons established as sacrificial tokens to achieve that greater strategic objective? Well, my answer to that now would be no. They originally intended to protect the travelers on the Bozeman Trail. But I think they had the effect, and this is a case where effect kind of dictates where policy goes from there and kind of drives actions of pulling the Indians away from the railroad. And so while it wasn't the initial objective of the Army to do that, it had that effect for the railroad. And then you kind of read, like, I got a quote here, Sherman's quote, I hope the President will continue to befriend these roads. All asking is comparative quiet in the year 1866, where by next year we can have the new cavalry enlisted, equipped and mounted, ready to go and visit these Indians where they live. His big dream was to hit back at the Indians, and he didn't get his chance really until 1876, but anyway, they were constantly preparing. It is our duty, and it shall be my study, to make the progress of construction of the great Pacific railways as safe as possible. I hope the present sector will continue as hitherto to defend these roads as far as the law allows. The Indian seems to oppose the opening of the new trail, but that must stimulate us to its prosecution, the Bozeman Trail, and you must rest assured that you'll be supported all as possible. We'll try and distinguish friendly from hostile and kill the latter, but if you or any other commanding officer strike a blow, I will approve, for it seems impossible to tell the true from the false, as far as whether Indians are good Indians or bad Indians. But this idea of the railroad, though, would constantly come up again. For instance, in Sherman's report of 1867, his annual report. This is 1866 report, I'm sorry. He talks about the fact that the Bozeman Trail had been established and that all these posts were located in a country claimed by the Northern Sioux, and this is an understatement of the best, who were more or less unfriendly. He then goes on to describe the Fetterman battle, pretty much following Carrington's description of the Fetterman battle, and finally gets into the idea of the significance, again, of these railroads. During the year, two most important enterprises in which the whole civilized world has an interest has been progress through this Indian country. The Omaha Pacific Railroad and the Kansas Pacific Railroad. The former was completed last year in running order as far as the forks of the Platte, 280 miles west of Omaha. And he says that he had traveled, myself, passed over 455 miles of finished railroad west of Omaha, and is satisfied with preparation made and materials at the Omaha Pacific Railroad will be finished and in good running order during the month of November as far as Cheyenne, the foot of the Rocky Mountains, a distance of 530 miles from Omaha. Although the Indian hostility somewhat embarrassed the surveying and grading parties, yet they have not materially delayed the work of the main construction. And going on, my instructions have been to extend to both these roads, these two railroads, as much military protection and assistance as the troops can spare, consistent with other heavy and important duties. And I shall continue the same general orders to aid these important enterprises. These roads, although in the hands of private corporations, have more than the usual claim on us for military protection, because the general government is largely interested. They aid us materially in our military operations by transporting troops and stores rapidly across the belt of land hitherto only passed in the summer by slow trains drawn by oxen dependent on the grass for food. All the states and territories west have a direct dependence on these roads for their material supplies. When these two great thoroughfares reach the base of the Rocky Mountains, and when the Indian title to roam at will over the country lying between them is extinguished, then the solution of this most complicated question of Indian hostilities will be comparatively easy. For this belt of country will naturally fill up with our own people, who will permanently separate the hostile Indians of the north from those of the south, and allow us to direct our military forces on one or the other pleasure, if therefore they continue their acts of hostility. Well, he was basically banking that was going to be the way it was. And it's the way it really was, if you look at it in terms of this thing, and I'm going to have another tangle here, so I think I'm going to give up on that. If you look at the fact that in 1866 then, the Treaty of 1868 was pretty much thrown out the window. And the fact that the railroads had progressed that far allowed for the transfer of troops. And in that way, the effect of the Bozeman Trail had been to draw the Indians away from the railroad. Not intentionally, not any smoke-filled room and plan to create some area that would sacrifice the troops on the Bozeman Trail, but just really the way that it turned out. That's about all I have to say. Any questions, comments? Yes?
Yes, Sonny. Mike Curry, whom I think you know,
Yes.
gave a presentation that we saw a video of, and in one of his presentations, he had a quote from a letter, you can straighten me out on this, from Sherman to Dodge.
Mm-hmm.
Dodge was clearly a former general and a friend of his. And I don't know when the date of the letter was, but in the letter, nor do I remember the quote, but it strongly intimated that they would fund the forts in Bozeman Trail to protect the railroad. Now, do you know that quote?
I know, and I've seen that letter too, but I don't have it. And Mike actually.
I don't want to be. I mean, that's too cynical. I don't want to believe that. But.
Well, none of us do, and I don't think it was. And I don't think that there was, Grant and Sheridan and Sherman sitting around thinking, okay, we're going to send these guys up, and it'll be like the French had planned on Dien Bien Phu, and then all the Indians are going to surround them, and that will draw them away from the railroad. I don't think that was the intent. I think it really was to protect the travelers. But the Army, you look at how the Army had been cut, they just didn't have the troops. They had one regiment of cavalry for the whole district of the Platte, including, which included, part of Colorado, all pretty much Wyoming, eastern Wyoming, western Nebraska, and they just didn't have the troops yet. They hadn't got those new regiments organized. Lieutenant Wands in here talks about, they talked about the quality that he was a Lieutenant Wands here at Fort Phil Kearny. He said that probably 9/10 of the troops here were raw recruits, that had never been in service at all before. And then they weren't doing target practice here at Fort Phil Kearny. They were building the fort. But the Indians were not going to do. Now the movies, you watch the movie, the Indians attack the fort in the movies, and they'll throw wave after wave after wave of Indians. You got dead Indians laying out in the prairie from a far distance, as far as you can see. That was not the way the Indians, they had neither the manpower nor the inclination to attack forts or fortified positions. Their entire idea was to strike small parties, appropriate livestock. I was going to use the word appropriate, and although they use steel and about everything in the military reports, appropriate livestock. And we just can't, we don't want to believe that might have been it, but maybe subconsciously that was the way they were looking at it. But I have never seen a real order that said, these guys are going to be, and there's inflammations, like that would have some effect. And it did have that effect. I mean, it did draw the Indians off. It drew thousands of them off that might have been down fighting against the railroad if it hadn't been for these forts up here. But I think it was more of an unintended effect that had a positive result for the railroads and for the Army. Any other questions? Thoughts on anything? Yes?
Horseshoe Station, where was that located with today's Wyoming towns?
You know where Glendo is?
Sure do.
Right there.
Okay.
It's right at the edge of Glendo. You can grab, there's a little road, and there's a little marker right there for it. And that's Horseshoe Creek, yes.
How far is that from Fort Benning?
About 40 miles maybe. It was real close.
Okay.
And that was the thing that supposedly, like Dixon and Phillips had really been paid just to go to Horseshoe Station. But when when Phillips was at Reno, Major Van Vost, or Wessels, there, Lieutenant Colonel Wessels, had given him some other papers to go down to the commander at Fort Laramie, and he went on to Fort Laramie for that reason, to deliver those messages.
What was that? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
What was that Horseshoe Station?
Basically a telegraph station.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just basically pretty much a television, minimum of a telegraph station, and that was about it. And a place you get an extra horse, I guess. Yes.
Have you come across records about how Montana militia branded horses wound up on the Bozeman Trail? No, the question's about Montana militia branded horses on the Bozeman Trail. Sherman and John in his book talks about the fact that Thomas Marr, who had been governor of Montana, and they had all started a great scare up there that the Indians were driving all the settlers out of the Gallatin Valley. General Sherman had the commander over at Camp Douglas send a major up. He investigated. The only thing he found was when John Bozeman got killed. It was the only Indian activity he found up there. Although Marr and then the succeeding governor tried to whip that up into getting several hundred militiamen. And it might have been that those horses, militia horses, might have been branded, and they might have went out and attempted some type of activity, and the Indians might have got a hold of their horses. I'm not sure, but I don't know. It's a good question. Where did where they ended up at? Where were they at in the Bozeman Trail? Well, apparently John Hart and others somehow got their hands on horses, and then as part of the suppression of the Montana militia, the government was rounding up these horses.
Oh, really?
Confiscating them.
Okay.
So they took them away from C.F. Smith to protect their investment. They got captured by the Cheyenne for their pains. There was a clampdown on that Montana militia bunch. Basically, they were also trying to start an Indian war, and eventually, with their efforts, not because of the fact of what they did there, but Fort Ellis up by Bozeman, which was built in many ways to counteract this idea of wanting to have a Montana militia, get rid of that idea, and have an established military post. And really, how many forts are there on the Bozeman Trail? Anybody? Yeah, 5. Correct, Mary Ellen. We talked about. There were really, if you think about it, because we always think of Fort C.S. Smith, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort Reno as being the Bozeman Trail forts. But Fort Fetterman was built in January of 1867 on the Bozeman Trail, and Fort Ellis up by Bozeman was built, I think, in August of 1867. And so you had, so really you could say there are five forts on the Bozeman Trail, not 3, if you want to do the whole continuation through it. Anything else? Anybody have any further questions before we break here? If not, thank you very much, and I'll be more than happy to visit with you.